Bates. I'm a fellow with the University Research Center, and I'm pleased that you could be here today for another installment of our research presentation series. Before I start, I want to remind everyone of the Faculty Scholarship Social that is tomorrow night, and also to make sure to draw your attention to the email that went out about the 5K writing challenge, and encourage all of you to participate in that. We'll send out another email reminder if anybody has a research or writing project that you are trying to get started or trying to finish. This is a chance to do just a little bit of trying to get a word count in every day for 2 weeks, and whoever has the highest word count at the end of 2 weeks will get $100 added to their Express account. So this is a chance for faculty to try to get a little bit of a writing challenge in. Today, our presenter is Dr. Lisa Crutchfield. She is a historian of early America and the Atlantic world, whose research focuses on race relations, especially frontier native-Anglo interaction. Her work as an ethnohistorian draws heavily upon history and anthropology as she examines cultures from both sides of the Atlantic and their engagement in colonial contexts. Currently, she is working on a manuscript that highlights the people who bridged those different cultures and the complexity of the relationships that were subsequently forged. She holds a Ph.D. in American history from the College of William and Mary, with an outside field in Colonial Latin America, a master's in history from the University of Georgia, and a BA in history and anthropology from James Madison University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Crutchfield.
Hello, y'all. Happy to be here today. I'm cognizant of the time. I know we got a little bit behind, so I hope that I will not keep you much past your hour lunchtime, but I hope you enjoy having lunch here with us. Robin, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thanks to the Research Center, Director Tom Bowman, Robin Bates for the invitation, and to all of you for being here. I'm excited to be here today to share some preliminary thoughts on the directions in which my current research is moving as I'm gearing up for a glorious sabbatical next semester. So I'd like to share with y'all some of the process, really in two parts. First, the more general and theoretical, and then second, putting that into practice with an example. And finally, I'll just conclude briefly with outlining some of my goals moving forward. So as a historian specializing in early America and the Atlantic world, my area of study often has me delving into conflict as empires clashed in the New World. The British, French, and Spanish competed to claim land and resources, and within that competition, the indigenous people of the region remained major power players throughout the colonial period and well into the 19th century. And while, to be sure, there was a heavy amount of conflict, indigenous people remained such a potent force that their actions often determined outcomes. Consequently, European nations often required and actively sought cooperation with local tribes. The deerskin trade buoyed the economy of the southern colonies for more than 100 years. Side note, I will speak a lot about traders. Please note that I'm referencing someone involved in the economic trade with a D, not trader with a T, as in a traitor to their country. So the deerskin trade buoyed the economy of the southern colonies for more than 100 years. Military alliances shaped the outcomes of colonial wars, necessitating that all major European powers court indigenous warriors, and colonists and indigenous people lived in close proximity, fostering social relationships of intimate and neighborly natures. My research explores these intercultural relations on specifically the colonial southeastern frontier. Especially after the Yamasee War and the founding of Georgia in 1733. In my current work, I focus on people who served as cultural brokers. These important players help to facilitate intercultural relations as go-betweens, translating language, material culture, and social and diplomatic customs from one side to the other. Now, successful cultural intermediaries required extensive knowledge of the language and evolving practices of both the Euro-American and the indigenous worlds. Their physical and cultural locations between the borders of two disparate societies meant that they had little trouble moving from one to the other. For most people, the borders that separated distinct cultures proved impermeable, but for cultural brokers, the boundaries became pathways that linked people rather than barriers that separated them. As the brokers created, manipulated, and occupied that space as their own, however, the location became identifiable not just as a pathway linking others, but as a viable place of its own accord. Certainly, brokers' roles in connecting cultures was an important one. Because of their unique location, cultural brokers aided both groups in understanding one another. They could provide insights into the complicated world of foreigners, for they understood their thought patterns and actions and knew how to respond accordingly. Their comprehension of different perspectives made them valuable to all sides, fostering understanding where confusion had reigned. They could move through either or both societies, as comfortable in one as in the other. When the Europeans and indigenous cultures first had sustained contacts with one another, these cultural intermediaries played a critical role. Scholars have devoted much research to such brokers as La Malinche in Mexico, Pocahontas in Jamestown, and Sacagawea in the Lewis and Clark expedition. As people settled down to a wary acceptance of the presence of another foreign culture, however, the role of cultural brokers actually became more important. Daily routines increasingly involved interactions between unfamiliar people and depended upon precise and unambiguous communication. As Euro-Americans and Native Americans became increasingly involved in each other's worlds, mediations became a crucial part of their interactions. And when people from different cultures confronted each other, they brought different cultural perceptions, expectations, meaning, and values to their exchanges, whether they involved trade, military alliances, sexual relationships, social obligations, or diplomacy. Anyone unfamiliar with the customs of the foreign culture could easily misinterpret words or actions. People who understood the protocol of both cultures limited the confusion that could arise under such circumstances by interpreting words, ideas, actions, and even material objects. As the colonial period progressed, Native Americans remained as power players and interaction between the cultures increased. As a result, brokers became more important to larger groups of people, not exclusively explorers and diplomats. Contemporaries understood the value of cultural brokers and heavily depended on them. For instance, the people who interacted with trader Cornelius Dowry claimed that, quote, he was always a willing composer of differences. The interpreter, Moses Nunez, was considered, quote, indispensably necessary. And Governor James Wright of Georgia asserted that he and a, quote, very good fellow, end quote, named St. Jago, who was a Creek living within ceded territory, were, quote, very good friends. Yet at the same time, even contemporaries were confused about where the cultural broker belonged, what their place was, often assuming that they must pay their loyalty exclusively to one side or the other. More than one Georgia official accused leading intermediaries of switching between indigenous and Anglo-American identities depending on their current agenda. Historians have also viewed cultural brokers in the same way, forcing them and their actions into a system of binary opposition that did not reflect their reality. Although scholars have long recognized the crucial role of cultural brokers throughout the colonial period, most have treated the subject by portraying these intermediaries as passive characters with no real agency of their own, but rather as tools or pawns of one side or the other. This construction creates a false dichotomy and obscures actions and intentions. If siding with the Native Americans, they are dangerous and suspect. If they are helping the colonists, they are passive and subordinate. This binary approach requires the subject to act on behalf of one side or the other, and therefore makes it impossible to see the individual's own actions in their own context. The focus is erroneously on which side are they serving, as a pawn, a messenger, or an advocate, as opposed to understanding how they are acting in their own interest. Additionally, as scholars examine cultural brokers through a binary lens, it needlessly pushes those intermediaries to the margins. They are viewed on the fringes of the society they bridged rather than occupying a central place. Francis Cartoonan has insisted that, quote, from cultural brokers' stories, we can learn at least as much about what it is to be a misfit as about what it is to be an Amerindian or an American. Nancy Hagedorn has corroborated this notion by diagnosing Andrew Montour, an interpreter of mixed descent in the colonial Northeast, with a quote-unquote identity crisis, claiming that he was caught between two worlds and unsure to which he belonged. In Frederick Fals's research into interpreters in early Jamestown, he identifies two of his examples as quote-unquote marginal men who suffered from a quote confused and uncertain cultural identification. Now, beginning with the assumption that cultural brokers exist on the fringes takes away their agency and makes them passive receptors of the forces around them. It also dilutes the strength and conviction of their serving in their own capacity and obscures their own agendas and reasonings for occupying those roles, further diminishing the broker themselves as well as their historical and cultural contributions. Now, contrary to the historiographical claims, in the colonial Southeast, in my area of study at least, cultural brokers did not suffer identity crises because they were firmly rooted in the cultural world of their own making that drew from both sides and served their unique purposes. Colonial traders who lived and worked among the indigenous people retained ties to the European world. In fact, they were trusted advisors of government officials, not wild men who had gone over to the dark side. Indigenous people who worked to mediate relations were viewed as powerfully connected leaders, not sellouts of whom their countrymen were ashamed. Indigenous women like Mary Musgrove, who married Euro-American men, were not disparaged because of their connections with a stranger. Instead, they enjoyed the added political and material benefits of marriage to whites, while they retained their ties to the people and ideals of their natal world. And the offspring of such biracial unions were not marginalized. People of mixed descent were fully accepted in indigenous communities and sometimes even favored because of their outside connections. In short, cultural brokers in the late colonial Southeast enjoyed the full range of benefits and acceptance by a variety of people who moved through the cultural broker space. Their actions do not need to be explained within a binary opposition of Native American versus European. They do not need to be conceived of as having identity crises, not knowing where they belong, and they do not need to be stigmatized with a marginal label in order to understand their motivations or to locate their place. Instead, they could belong to both, or even something new, all their own, with an identity that they understood and occupying a central place. And so, I became interested in exploring the place of cultural brokers. I'm particularly interested in examining the varied roles that they filled, how they were viewed and valued by the groups that they brought together, as well as working to understand how they defined the spaces they occupied and actively created for themselves. At first, this was theoretical. It seemed to me that rather than limiting the concept to a bridge spanning two cultures or focusing exclusively on binary worlds of Native American, European, a reconceptualization of the space created and occupied by the cultural broker would help to better highlight their motivations, their roles, and their place in colonial America at the center, rather than at the fringes. This relocating of cultural brokers would bring them into a physical space that was of their own creation and central to defining their world, rather than existing on the margins. So we've talked about the, problematic historiography thus far. I was searching for alternate lenses and theoretical approaches that might help shape a new definition of the role and reality of cultural brokers. One that locates them in the center, restores their agency, and makes certain that they are not victims of a multiple personality disorder imposed upon them by either contemporaries or modern scholars. Instead of focusing on binary opposition, marginality and identity crises, concepts of creolization, multiple boundaries, and frontier fluidity might be more useful points of departure. And so concept number one, creolization. As scholars struggle with the identity of cultural brokers, especially in the colonial Southeast, it might help to remember the concept of creolization that was affecting this locale within the context of the larger Atlantic world. Historians of the greater British Caribbean, like James Mulcahy, tell us that despite colonists' best attempts to recreate the British world, a slew of environmental factors, the presence of a variety of people, and the socioeconomic institutions they created resulted in the emergence of distinctive Creole societies. Raphael Confiant argues that, quote, the Creole does not possess a new identity like the Gallo-Roman or the Arab-Berber, but new identities, pluralized. The phenomenon of creolization has invented from all these fragments a multiple identity, end quote. For our cultural broker then, their identity does not need to be defined as one or the other, as Native American or European. The presence of indigenous and European in a new and foreign context allowed for the creation of a creolized space, one that was unique and distinctive. While Native Americans, brokers, and colonists all occupied space in proximity to each other, these spaces all define and imply the other. Each space intersects the other. And the broker space is not either or, nor a hybrid of the two, but a unique product defined in relation to, but separate from, the others. It is their own space, created through their own practices. Second concept, multiple boundaries. The space in which cultural brokers maneuvered appeared to be subject to different and multiple boundaries, thus defining a space in a unique way to those cultural brokers who moved through it. A location which has multiple meanings for different people or different time periods, allowing multiple spaces to exist in the exact same location. These multiple boundaries did not limit the cultural broker nor constrain the space in which they moved, but rather created multiple spaces simultaneously, multiple worlds of which they were a part that existed at the same time, but which had different boundaries. The existence of multiple cultures, Euro, Native American, broker, occupying the same space allowed for the creation of a unique cultural space that encompasses the other two. Additionally, the same area constitutes a different reality, or served a different function for the society, depending on the time in which it is viewed or the perspective of the viewer. As an example, the frontier, which to some thus served as a demarcation, right, the boundary on the fringes between the two cultures, the frontier. It can also be the exact same space redefined by different boundaries as a central location where the cultural broker was dominant. The location on the margins of each individual culture is the same place as the flourishing, intersecting, overlapping space created and dominated by cultural brokers. Depending then on one's perspective, the same space may constitute either the fringes or the centrality. Rather than examining the fringes or the bridges connecting the two wholes, I argue that we should be studying the redefined boundaries of the overlapping creolized space. This alternate perspective may offer new dimensions on who belongs to, occupies, and controls that space. Our third concept is the fluidity of the frontier. An integral component of these multiple boundaries is the reality that cultural brokers are working on a frontier. Frontiers in general, and the colonial Georgian frontier in particular, created a unique space that served as a meeting ground between cultures, and because of the intermixing, allowed for relations and opportunities that at other places and times might not be feasible. Life on the frontier for both sides hinged on successful diplomatic, economic, military, and social alliances, and brokers who were in the position to influence those could create important advantages for themselves, as well as sway the outcomes for each group. Some of my other work has explored the fluidity in racial and gender hierarchies that existed on the early Georgia frontier, revealing a social reality in the colonial era that stands in sharp contrast to the hierarchies that will become entrenched in Southern society in the later post-revolutionary era. That frontier fluidity defies the rigid categorization of people, and useful to me in this work, therefore challenges the artificial binary imposed upon cultural brokers, reminding us instead that the space that cultural brokers occupied was much more fluid. So, that's where I was, and that's what I was mulling over last spring, when a call for papers came across my desk for the Women's History Association of Ireland. I was very eager for an opportunity to present at an international conference and share my ideas with a broad group of people dedicated to women's history. I know that women's history part is not clear yet, but bear with me. But what intrigued me the most was the theme of the conference: women in loss from the medieval through the ages, including, they said, seeking papers on what or how women gained, even when they may have lost. And I was really excited. First off, one of the best examples I have of a successful cultural broker creating their own unique space was female, and this gave me an opportunity to put my thoughts into practice with a real-life example. And secondly, I had just read Ben Marsh's Georgia's Frontier Women, which argues that the frontier conditions of Georgia, that fluid frontier I talked about earlier, created unique opportunities for women. So there's the something to gain. In the case of my female example, there was a risk of losing pieces of her original cultural identity, but what did she stand to gain as she transformed that space into something unique that worked for her and her agenda, her own agenda and goals? So I submitted, was accepted, and thanks to support from the Turner Fund, I was off to Ireland to present my ideas on creolized identity, multiple boundaries, and a fluid frontier through the example of Mary Musgrave. So let me first introduce the geography to get you guys situated a little bit. Again, here we are on the colonial southeastern frontier. You guys can note that South Carolina is there, Florida down there at the bottom. We'll zoom in here in a minute or two. You'll notice that Georgia is not here yet. Georgia will be founded after the date of this map. I also have absolutely no clever segue arranged at this point. So here is my conference paper as it was presented. Recent scholarship has highlighted the frontiers, that frontiers create unique conditions which allow marginalized people, including women, opportunities they may have been denied in more established places. Living between two worlds, however, also frequently translated into high levels of loss. High child mortality rates, disproportionate gender ratios, and intercultural violence often meant that family formation did not follow a predictable pattern. In addition, for those women attempting to bridge two different cultures, there were added risks of losing pieces of their cultural identities. Within the context of these losses, however, was potential for great transformation, especially within a frontier environment that allowed greater flexibility in traditional gender roles and encouraged new directions for fortunes, power, and reinvention of self. By examining the indigenous Anglo frontier in colonial Georgia and using the example of Mary Musgrave, a woman of mixed Anglo-Creek descent who purposely cultivated an identity embracing both her Creek and her Anglo heritage, this paper explores how frontier conditions allowed women to transform potential losses into gains that could be used to transcend their initial position, broaden their spheres of influence, and reinvent themselves as major power brokers respected by people on both sides of the cultural divide. So again, back to our map to acclimate ourselves. We take a look here, from here, if we zoom in, you guys can still see the South Carolina there. What would not have shown up obviously on that first map until we highlighted up maybe is to get your groundings right. Here's Charlestown and highlighted there in the yellow. There is really an area, maybe a village, known as Pond, South Carolina. That's within the square. And then you'll notice in the big rectangle over there, we have a variety of the creek towns situated, just so you get the geography of how close and where people are to one another. So, born to a Creek mother and a white Englishman around 1700, Mary was known among the Creeks as Kusabunokisa. As a person of mixed descent, Mary was brought up learning the values of both of her parents' cultures. She spent her earliest formative years among the Creeks, raised by her mother and maternal relatives, while retaining close connections to her English father, who was frequently based in the Creek town of Coweta, as one of the many European men situated in indigenous towns for the purposes of trading economic goods. At the age of 7, Mary's father brought her to Pond, South Carolina, where she was, as she stated, quote, baptized, educated, and bred up in the principles of Christianity, end quote. By the time she returned to Coweta as a teenager, just after the Yamasee War, her identity was interwoven with both the English and the Creek, fluent in both languages, fully understanding the governing principles of both cultures, and comprehending the values of both religions. Mary's first of 3 marriages occurred within the context of the aftermath of the 1715 Yamasee War. Some assert that Mary, as the niece of the famed Creek leader Brims, was betrothed to a British colonel's son named Johnny Musgrove in order to confirm the peace, while others acknowledge that the union was likely made on their own terms. After their marriage, the couple moved to Musgrove lands back in Pompon, South Carolina, where they started a family. And here they continued to mold identities that would be beneficial for themselves and be embraced by both Euro and Amerindian worlds. Both Mary and Johnny had white fathers, had been educated among the colonists and Christianized, led respectable planter lives, and the patriarchal English accepted them as belonging to colonial society. At the same time, however, the couple maintained their matrilineal Creek connections as well. Mary returned to Coweta for the birth of her first child, and indigenous friends and relatives frequently visited the Musgrove homestead in South Carolina, reinforcing the Musgroves' tribal ties and kinship obligations. In addition, the Musgroves were active and successful in the trade, an occupation surely helped by their indigenous networks, and one that kept them in close contact with the Creeks. They therefore successfully maintained their connections to both sides. The frontier conditions did not require them to lose the part of themselves distinctly Creek or English, instead allowing, maybe even encouraging them to actively cultivate identities that uniquely served their own goals and agendas under these fluid frontier circumstances. And so I'll direct you to another map here. This is after Georgia has been founded, and you can see Georgia all the way across, taking all the territory. They were very excited to have Georgia there. You may or may not know that Georgia is founded as a buffer in between South Carolina and Florida, so please do note that we have Florida down here, and this is still Spanish Florida at this point. So the crucial area that we're talking about here is this buffer zone between British South Carolina and Spanish Florida. You can also notice if you zoom in on this map, you can see that Georgia is here, you can see part of Carolina, you can see part of Florida. If you look very closely, you can see some indigenous names, Lower Creek, Middle Creek. If we zoom in, you can see them better. So again, here, I don't know if that's showing up for y'all out there, but Middle Creeks, Lower Creeks, Yamacraws, along the Yamasee in this general region. I'll show you one more map. We'll focus in more on the coastline, a little bit closer to this end of things. And so you see this map here from 1747. You can note that Savannah is, well, I'll give it all away. The green square in the middle there, when we zoom in, that is Savannah. You can see the Yamacraws, that is an indigenous group, a subset of the Creeks. Out there to the side, to the left, and then if you focus on that square and we zoom in, you can again see this is the town of Savannah. When it is set up in 1733, that's the founding of Georgia, the capital city there. The Yamacraws obviously very close by. And if you zoom in even further, you'll see something which I think is totally interesting and cool. If you zoom in even further, there's our town of Savannah, there's the Yamacraws out to the left, and you'll notice this little thing up here called Matthews. That is Mary Musgrove Matthews. She's now on to her second husband by now. That is the trading post that she establishes just outside of the town of Savannah before Savannah is created. So that's our lay of the land. So as a woman of mixed descent, right now we're back to her being married and moving back to Pompon in South Carolina. As a woman of mixed descent, employed in an occupation that literally connected Anglo and Native American worlds, Mary used the frontier conditions of the early 18th century American Southeast to her advantage. As stated in the treaty that ended the Yamasee War, the area south of the Savannah River was completely off limits to English settlers, not even allowing English traders to operate there. Showcasing that Mary, as well as her Creek neighbors, continued to hold fast to her indigeneity, in 1732, the Yamacraws invited the Musgroves to relocate their trading post from Pompon down south of the Savannah River, in that land that was not allowed for English people to be. The lack of opposition by the South Carolina government indicates their willingness as well to recognize her indigenous roots. And as a colony dependent on slavery from the start, South Carolina had an emerging racial order for Black and white people, but under fluid frontier conditions where indigenous people maintained a significant amount of power, as evidenced by the recent war, those racial lines were not as rigid for Native Americans, especially those of mixed descent. So she gets established there in 1732. The following year would bring the establishment of a new British colony, Georgia, an endeavor in which Mary would play important roles for the next 30 years. With the creation of this new frontier, people like Mary, who had identities that could mediate between the two cultures, became even more important. And by the time James Oglethorpe and the first Georgia colonists arrived in the capital city of Savannah in early 1733, the Musgroves were well established economically in their new location, and they were entrenched culturally. They were not foreigners or interlopers encroaching on indigenous territory or threatening colonial settlements. They had forged identities that allowed them to be viewed by both cultures as friends and allies, and most importantly, as a welcome connection between the two. Both culturally and geographically, the Musgroves were in the perfect position to negotiate between the indigenous people and the new Georgia colonists. The nearby Yamacraws must have been understandably concerned upon hearing of Oglethorpe's plans for a new colony, but Mary reminded them of the possibilities: increased trade, protection, and a chance to improve their stature among the larger Creeks, and thus convinced the Yamacraws to allow the New English settlement. Then, when Oglethorpe sought an audience, with and permission from the larger Creek nation, Mary was the one who secured both, resulting in an Anglo-Creek Treaty of Alliance on May 21st, 1733. For the next 3 decades, Mary purposefully fostered her identity as a critical diplomat, with Oglethorpe naming her, quote, chief interpreter and emissary to the Creek nation, end quote. In this role, Mary fulfilled a variety of duties, including everything from hostess to intelligence gatherer. With her thriving plantation, she supplied a variety of food for the new colonists to carry them over until harvest. The Musgroves provided field crops, slaughtered beef from their cow pen, and Mary used her influence to have indigenous allies bring in a ready supply of venison and turkey. In addition, the Musgroves contributed much hospitality for visiting guests, both indigenous and colonial. Situated on the outskirts of Savannah town and directly along the trading paths, the Musgrove plantation was the ideal location for the two cultures to meet on common ground. With no facilities in which to house visiting emissaries in town, the Savannah magistrates depended on the Musgroves to play host. And better than anyone else in the colony, Mary understood that Creek culture required hospitality for visiting dignitaries and knew exactly what the headman expected. The Musgroves trading post was also the source of the colony's diplomatic gifts to the indigenous people. With Mary overseeing everything, she was not only able to provide the necessary items, she had the cultural knowledge to understand the symbolic importance attributed to the presents, which items would be most appreciated, and how to best distribute the gifts among the headmen according to their various ranks of power and prestige. The Musgrove homestead certainly served as a meeting place in an unofficial capacity as well, open to white and indigenous people alike. On one festive occasion, quote, several boats well filled with townspeople went up to the Musgroves, end quote, to join in a celebration. At another time, a large group of colonists had ventured there and stayed 2 or 3 days and nights drinking and having fun, while the Creeks, quote, daily flocked around their house. So there's little doubt that for people hoping to find a hospitable, friendly outpost that served as a cultural crossroads, the Musgroves was the place to be. Now, not all Georgians approved of the frivolity, however. One of the Salzburger's parishioners was horrified to discover, quote, some Indians and white people of both sexes jumping around in the hut in a shameful manner as if they were entirely mad, end quote. For the Salzburgers, this dancing was a, quote, unheard of disgrace, end quote. But for Mary and her friends and neighbors who visited, it was a happily familiar occurrence. Like other traders, one of the most important functions that Musgrove served was in securing diplomatic information concerning the temper of the Creek nation. They repeatedly relayed vital details concerning indigenous activities and viewpoints, and most importantly, serve to maintain or restore friendly relations when offenses occurred. I was not supposed to do that, sorry. Mary's role as a diplomat earned her prestige and economic success. It was a representation that depended on her persisting in both her Anglo and Greek identities, and other circumstances appearing to embrace one or the other to Mary's advantage. But the reality that for different situations and at different times, she embraced one and then the other, and the three examples showcased below will illuminate how she was deftly navigating the creation of her own identity for her own purposes, a creolized space with multiple boundaries. So I've got three examples for us up here, three elements as case studies. My slide and the transfer somehow supposed to give one of them at a time to you, but here we go. Example number one. Despite living on the frontier between Greek and Anglo worlds, Mary often made it known, in the colonial records at least, that she considered herself a Christian woman. At a young age, she had been baptized. She asserted that she was brought up in the, quote, brought up in the Christian principles, end quote, and all three of her marriages, including her first to Johnny Musgrove, were sanctified by Christian ceremonies. According to missionary Benjamin Ingham, Mary could, quote, read and write, end quote, and he judged her to be a, quote, well-civilized woman, end quote. That civilization included taking the Eucharist routinely. The pious Salzburgers viewed her as a Christian neighbor and as a welcomed visitor to their enclave in Ebenezer. She visited their school and observed Sunday services with them routinely. Their minister, Johann Boltius, believed that she was a, quote, very good Christian, end quote. And when John Wesley of Methodist fame served as the minister to Savannah, Mary often met with him for hours for what he noted in his personal diary as, quote unquote, religious talks. She even accepted the role of godmother, although whether to children of indigenous people or colonists is not entirely clear. Given the general lack of converted Greeks in Georgia at this time, however, it is far more likely that it was British parents who trusted Mary to spiritually guide their children and to help them lead a proper life, proper Christian life. That position, of course, speaks volumes about the trust they put in her, and the remarkable position Mary secured as a woman of mixed descent in this frontier society. From colonists to ministers, clearly her white neighbors accepted her as a good Christian woman. Our second example is in the court of law. Secondly, Mary embraced her Englishness in the court of law. One might expect that cases in colonial Georgia would rarely favor someone like Mary. Yet in every instance, not only was Mary allowed to bring suit, even as a woman of mixed heritage, but the court firmly supported her in their judgments. These examples showcase the, relatively speaking, immense social and economic opportunities a seemingly marginalized person, a woman of mixed heritage in the colonial era, could have exploited on the colonial Georgia frontier, highlighting the social fluidity in existence at that place and time. Mary's appearance in court centered on her societal status in relation to one of her business partners, Joseph Watson. Watson joined the Musgroves trading business in 1734. But instead of aiding Mary in the business and in wider indigenous affairs, Watson quickly became problematic. In an effort to further his trading with them, Watson freely employed the use of liquor, both for his own consumption and that of his trading partners. And in August of 1734, Watson appeared before the court 3 different times. All 3 occasions shared commonalities. One, the cases involved disputes between Watson, as a white Englishman, and local indigenous Creek people. 2, Mary Musgrove, a female of mixed ethnicity, played a significant role in each court case. And 3, each time the colonial court ruled against Watson. In dealing with her troublesome neighbor and business partner, Mary sought this legal recourse through the colonial courts to protect herself and other indigenous people. She employed an English institution to which she had rights as an English woman, and Georgia's colonial courts afforded Mary legitimate recourse. As a Christian, Mary was allowed to testify under oath, to present evidence pertinent to any ongoing cases before the court, and to sue for damages. When Watson attacked her personal character, she consulted with Georgia magistrates and then brought, quote, an action against him for calling her witch, end quote. Now this is no trifling matter. Accusations of witchcraft were the ultimate gender slur of the day, with potentially life-threatening consequences. And even if not substantiated, the accusations that Mary, quote, had bewitched people, end quote, could severely affect her economic and social standing. Not only did the colonial Georgia courts allow Mary to bring suit and to testify against Watson, they found in her favor, requiring him to pay 6 shillings for damages. 2 weeks later, she hauled him before the court again. This time, she sued him for assault, for, quote, endeavoring to shoot Mrs. Musgrove, end quote. Testimony stated that, quote, it appeared very plain that he had shot her if she had not overpowered him in her own defense and took the gun from him and broke him. I wish that storyline told me more, but that's what I have. Again found guilty, Watson paid £5 damages, and he was ordered to be bound for his good behavior. Watson's third and final case that month occurred the very next day, when he was called to court again to face another charge of assault. In this instance, he was tried for, quote, beating the Stichi, the Indian, and defrauding him of his goods, end quote. Mary is not the one that brought the suit in this case, but she presented evidence on the Stichi's behalf, and the court once again found Watson guilty and ordered him to not only pay a fine, but to additionally make restitution to a Stichi for the trade items. These examples make it clear that the Savannah courts had no problem with her bringing a case or testifying, and that Mary leaned into her English identity as a strategy to protect herself and others. And then in my third example, known as the Bosworth controversy, clearly Mary had employed her status as a Christian and as an Englishwoman to her advantage, but she was equally adept at calling upon her Creek heritage to define her identity, as our third example shows. We have already seen how Mary utilized her Creek identity to secure a trading post in the New Georgia Territory in 1732, which led to decades of support for Oglethorpe and the Georgians. In the later years of her life, Mary made a concerted effort to silence any critics, assert her legal rights, and obtain rightful recompense for her services to the fledgling colony. These efforts, labeled by irate Georgia officials as the Bosworth controversy, may have caused the officials such consternation because in its arguments, Mary reminded the officials of her indigeneity as well as her rights as an Englishwoman, showing that she viewed herself neither as one nor the other, but rather occupied a space with multiple boundaries. On one hand, she claimed Creek lineage, and thus the right for Creek relatives to deed her land, reminding the colonial magistrates that she was, quote, queen of the Creeks. Not just a Creek, she was queen of the Creeks. In addition, in a legal sense, and as an English woman, she was within her rights to ask for recompense for the services she had abundantly provided the colony. Mary's financial sacrifices on behalf of Georgia were well documented, and her calculations erred on the low side. The modest petitions were the request of a legitimate businesswoman who understood the legal and cultural principles and procedures of both of the cultures to which she belonged. The issue came to a head in Savannah in August of 1749, when loyal Creek kinsmen supportive of Mary's claims came into town and encountered defensive and paranoid colonial magistrates. On the surface, it appears that the magistrates argued against Mary's rights as a Creek to receive title to Creek lands given by Creek chiefs. But in reality, the concern stemmed from other issues that arose because of her success and influence as a cultural broker and her acceptance in both societies. Mary understood the rights that came with membership in each society. She knew that because of her kinship connections and status as a Creek beloved woman, she had legitimate claims to Creek land. And she also knew that she could pursue legal action as an Englishwoman, but that her Englishness also weakened her argument for her claims to the indigenous lands. And furthermore, the presence of Mary's third husband presented a problem. Thomas Bosworth was a full-blooded Englishman, and according to the English laws of the time, any of Mary's property automatically became his. The magistrates were probably not happy that Mary, as a British colonist, was asserting her Creek rights to the lands, but it was at least partially because she was inextricably tied up with Thomas that they could not validate that land claim. The grant to Mary, legitimate or not, meant in English patriarchal society a grant to Thomas, and according to English law, they could not separate the two. So Mary was in this predicament precisely because she identified as both, occupying a creolized space with multiple boundaries. Being a daughter and a wife of an Englishman, she had strong patriarchal ties to English society. And following the protocol of that culture, she pursued the correct legal channels to petition for redress, and she understood that her property would belong to her husband, as she made him the grantee in each of her petitions. She had lived her life among the English so successfully as a member of their society that they viewed her as an English woman. But she also held fast to her indigenous roots, knowing her family lineage gave her important rights within that culture. For their part, the Creeks equally believed her to be one of their own, and said exactly that in a tense moment whenever a Savannah magistrate demanded that the interpreter, quote, ask the Indians whether Mary was an Indian or a white person, end quote. In response, they, the indigenous people, all declared that they looked upon her as an Indian and one of themselves, end quote, and did not understand why there was an issue with her use of Creek lands. Contemporaries of cultural brokers like Mary Musgrave could not recognize the existence of such a creolized space, and specifically questioned their identity, forcing them instead into a binary opposition of one or the other. During the Bosworth controversy, Magistrate Henry Parker questioned Mary's Christianity, and once confirmed, he concluded, quote, that those spiritual advantages deprived her of her natural right as an Indian, meaning that to Parker, one could not be both a Christian and an Indian, end quote. And then he asked her outright if she was Indian or white, forcing her to choose sides, negating the reality of the space she had created for herself. Parker could not conceive of a space outside of the binary opposition, instead forcing her to choose one of the two cultures, leaving her dislocated on the fringes if she chose the space of her own making. Modern day scholars should not follow that lead, instead recognizing the existence of a Creole identity that could embody both white and indigenous. The reality that Parker could not comprehend was that the world Mary lived in had multiple boundaries that were not mutually exclusive. In colonial Georgia, Mary could, during the course of her common routine, move in between her Cowpens trading post, where she entertained Native Americans and colonists alike, Fort Frederica, where she helped Colonel Herron to recruit and deliver indigenous allies, her birth town of Coweta, as comfortably as a member or as a diplomatic envoy, and colonial Savannah as a legitimate citizen and owner of land and property. This constellation of widely disparate places was her space. As a cultural broker, she eschewed the binary of Native American European, instead working off of a cultural map that had different boundaries than those which circumscribed other people. So when confronted in Savannah on that day and forced by Parker to choose which side she most closely identified herself with, in this instance, she chose the Creeks. And the Georgia magistrates were stunned for having fully expected her to state that she was a subject of the English crown, for that is indeed how they viewed her. One magistrate, so shocked by her answer, retorted, quote, "Madam, if I had told you so, you would have spit in my face," end quote. Now, as a careful cultural diplomat, Mary likely would not have taken that uncouth approach, but the sentiment was well understood. She would have taken offense to any colonist suggesting that she was not an English woman. It was not up to him to ascribe to Mary her identity, indigenous, European, or a combination. The decision of which cultural values to embrace was hers to make. So Kusapuna Kisa, colonial diplomat, Christian, English woman, Mary Musgrave Matthews Bosworth, and Queen of the Creeks, all of these are valued identities that help to highlight the complicated nature of cultural brokers' existence and showcase how frontier conditions allowed fluidity in the normally rigid hierarchy of race and gender. Musgrave faced the loss of children and marriage partners while navigating the changing borderland between Anglo and indigenous societies. And as a female of mixed descent, finding a place where she belonged could have been difficult, perhaps requiring her to discard either her Creek or her British identity. However, she successfully capitalized on the frontier conditions to create a place of value for herself as a cultural broker that incorporated her two identities, negotiating her own authority and working to validate her own position. So that's where I am in terms of thinking about the place of cultural brokers, and specifically examining Mary Musgrove as a female cultural broker who actively created her own creolized space on the Georgia frontier. I'm working to be able to argue that she did not view her world, her place, as a binary, that she did not exclusively choose one or another, tracing examples of her commitment to her own multiple boundaries. And even when pushed into choosing between binaries, her response varied, and thus her reality, her concept of place, was something other than either or. Both of these threads of thoughts, the general idea of reconceptualizing the cultural broker's place, and specifically exploring the example of Mary Musgrove, relied heavily on the Colonial Records of Georgia, a published set of 32 volumes of archival material, including trustees' notes, journals of colony founders, and records of the colony secretary. They're fantastic resources. They're filled with exciting items, including memorials and petitions from Mary Musgrove herself. But I had seen some obscure references indicating that there were 7 more unpublished volumes. And thanks to Jeff Harbin, our librarian, for helping to confirm first their existence and then their archival location. And thanks to the Mednick Award and the support of Dean Cheryl Coleman, I was able to go to the National Archives at East Point last summer and track those down. So now, for my upcoming sabbatical, I have about 4,200 pages of handwritten manuscript documents to work through. So if my emails in the spring semester start signing my signature, start signing off, your humble and obedient servant, as all of these do, you'll understand where my head is at. As I work through these, I'm hoping to strengthen the argument that cultural brokers were fully accepted by both sides and work to get a better understanding of cultural brokers' own views on their place. The set of archival material will hopefully help me to continue to explore those themes of cultural interaction and identity and make a stronger case for the centralized place of cultural brokers on the colonial frontier. Thank you for your time. And I know we started late, and I know I probably went slightly longer than I should have. But if we have a few minutes for questions. If y'all need to leave, then of course, please feel free to leave. And Robin, I don't know if you need to.
I need to do
Assuming you have an editor who can cut that.
This isn't so much of a question as it is just sort of something that I thought was really like intriguing. I mean, you've presented this really compelling case that these cultural brokers exist on these frontier spaces. But I just thought the positioning of Georgia in and of itself is a fascinating one, that it's between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. And so, yeah, I thought that was an interesting kind of
Place.
place that all of this happens to be taking place.
Yeah.
I mean, because presumably there are lots of these places throughout society, but that just seemed to be an additional element that would be interesting.
For sure. I think that aids, especially in terms of the military alliances and the reliance upon indigenous people because of the presence of the Spanish still there. The other thing I'll say about Georgia too that surprises me is, as you said, in terms of thinking about it as this place, it's also the fact that it's the last, right? It's 13th colony, so you kind of expect by this point, we've had 150 years or so of indigenous relations, and whether some people tend to, in some areas they're not as prevalent and important as time goes on, but certainly as late as the Revolutionary period, or leading up to the Revolutionary period, and these guys are still major power players in the region. Yeah.
I mean, that's so interesting, as things are going really south relationally in a lot of other places. Mm-hmm. That's so interesting that this is.
And I don't want to make it, I don't want to paint it, I mean, I did mention intercultural violence briefly too, right? I mean, it's certainly not all, happiness and love and for sure, but pardon me?
It's functioning.
But it's functioning, and there's a lot more, even from, and I expected it at the diplomatic level, but when you've got a picture of Von Reck talking about the guy that lived with us for a while, right? This is where in the world is it, right? This is the guy that hung out with us for a while. I mean, the interrelations on on a, not just a diplomatic level, but right, just sort of the, hey, we ran into these 3 guys today while we were hunting and we stopped and, you know, they gave us some venison and we gave them some this. I mean, it's all over the records as late as the 1770s, at least down in Georgia.